There is a voice you never forget. Not because it was the loudest in the room, or the most technically perfect, or the most celebrated by critics, who wrote their reviews in rooms that smelled of cigarette smoke and ambition. You never forget it, because it found something in you that you didn't know needed finding. It slipped past your defenses, past the noise of everyday life, and settled somewhere deep and quiet, like a hand placed gently on your shoulder by someone who understood exactly what you were going through without you having to say a single word. That was Engelbert Humperdinck. That was what he did to people. And for a brief, shining stretch of time in the late 1960s, he did it to the entire world all at once. You might remember him as a romantic hero, the man with the dark eyes and the velvet voice who made women weep and men straighten their collars in quiet envy. You might remember the sold-out arenas, the television appearances, the records that seemed to play everywhere at once, from transistor radios on summer porches to jukeboxes in dimly lit bars where people slow danced like the world wasn't watching. You might remember Release Me, that impossible song that somehow stopped the Beatles in their tracks. And if you remember all of that, then what you are about to hear is going to sit with you for a long time. Because the man behind all of it, the man who sold over 140 million records and shared stages with Elvis Presley and Dean Martin, the man who charmed the world with love songs for nearly 6 decades, is now 89 years old. He lives alone in a house in Southern California, a house that used to be full of laughter and music and the quiet, ordinary magic of a life shared with someone you love more than you ever thought it was possible to love another human being. And that person is gone now. And the house is still there. And he stays in it anyway, because leaving would feel like letting go of the last thread connecting him to her. This is not a story about fame. Fame is the easy part to tell. This is a story about what fame costs, what it takes from a person in the dark, in the quiet, in the years that the cameras don't follow. This is the story of a man who survived tuberculosis, legal battles, public humiliation, financial ruin, and a name ban in an entire country, only to face the one thing he was never equipped to survive: watching the woman he loved disappear slowly, irreversibly, memory by memory, until the eyes that had looked at him with recognition for over 50 years looked at him and saw a stranger. But before we get there, because we will get there, and it will break your heart the way only the truth can, we need to go back to the beginning, back before the name, back before the fame. Back to a boy that almost nobody remembers, because almost nobody knew he existed yet. His name was Arnold George Dorsey. He was born on May 2nd, 1936, in Madras, India, at a time when the country was still part of the British Empire. He was one of 10 children, raised in a household where music was present, but survival was the first priority. The family eventually relocated to Leicester, England, and it was there, in the gray and grinding ordinariness of post-war Britain, that Arnold Dorsey first understood what his voice could do to a room. He was a teenager who could silence people simply by opening his mouth. That is a rare and terrifying gift to discover about yourself when you are young and have no idea yet what to do with it. He began performing under his birth name, then as Jerry Dorsey, a name that had a certain swing-era charm but opened no doors and made no one stop walking. The music industry is not a place that rewards patience or talent on its own. It rewards timing, connections, and sometimes simply the right person walking through the right door at the right moment. For years, none of those things happened for Arnold Dorsey. And then something happened that nearly ended everything before it began. He contracted tuberculosis. In an era before the medical advances we take for granted today, tuberculosis was not simply an illness. It was a sentence. It was the kind of diagnosis that rewrote your future in a language you hadn't chosen and couldn't argue with. For a singer, a man whose entire instrument was housed in the fragile architecture of his lungs, it was as close to a death of purpose as you could get without actually dying. He had to stop. He had to recover. He had to sit quietly and wait while the world kept moving without him, and wonder whether the voice would survive what the illness was putting his body through. It did survive, but the years lost to illness left him further behind than ever. He was a talented singer with no breaks, no momentum, and no name that anyone cared to remember. And then Gordon Mills walked into his life, and everything changed in the most unexpected way imaginable. Mills was already managing Tom Jones, which meant he understood something fundamental about transforming raw, unglamorous talent into a phenomenon that the public couldn't resist. He heard something in Arnold Dorsey that the industry had been too impatient or too unimaginative to hear. But what he did next was either an act of mad genius or a joke that somehow became real. He gave the struggling singer a new name, Engelbert Humperdinck, the name of a 19th-century German composer who had written a fairy tale opera called Hansel and Gretel. It was long. It was strange. It was completely impossible to say without committing to it fully. And it should not have worked. By every rational calculation, it absolutely should not have worked. But then came Release Me, and the world stopped being rational about Engelbert Humperdinck. The song had been sitting on a shelf for 3 months, collecting dust while radio stations ignored it and record stores declined to stock it. It was a ballad in an era beginning to tremble with the electricity of rock and roll, and nobody believed that a slow, aching love song sung by a man with an unpronounceable name was going to matter. And then he appeared on Sunday night at the London Palladium, one of the most watched television programs in Britain, and sang it in front of the country. The next morning, 80,000 copies were ordered in a single day. Within weeks, that number would peak at 127,000 copies sold in one day alone. Release Me climbed to number 1 in the United Kingdom and sat there for 6 weeks. And in doing so, it did something that almost no song had ever managed to do. It blocked the Beatles. Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, 2 of the most celebrated songs in the history of popular music, never reached the top spot in Britain because Engelbert Humperdinck was already standing there. He later said the Beatles didn't seem to mind. They already had plenty of number ones. It was his very first, and he held on to it with everything he had. The fame that followed was the kind that rewrites a person's understanding of what is possible. He appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, and America opened its arms. Release Me peaked at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. Arenas sold out on both sides of the Atlantic. Women did not simply admire him from a distance. They fainted. They rushed the stage. They wrote him letters by the thousands, letters that spoke of longing in a language that surprised even him with its intensity. Elvis Presley, the man who had invented a certain kind of masculine electricity in popular music, sought him out in Las Vegas and told him quietly that he was also performing a lot of Humperdinck songs. That kind of recognition from that particular man was not something you forgot, and he never did. But fame is a strange and complicated house to live in. The rooms look beautiful from the outside, and some of them truly are. But there are corridors that nobody shows you when you first arrive, and doors that open onto things you were not prepared to find. What the public celebrated as a golden era was also, beneath the surface, a time of accumulating pressures and quiet disasters that would only fully reveal themselves later. And some of what was building in those years, the legal battles, the financial turbulence, the public humiliations, was merely the prelude to something far more devastating than any of it. Something so personal and so final that it made everything else feel, in retrospect, like practice for grief. But we are not there yet. And what came before the grief is worth understanding, because it tells you exactly who this man is and what he was made of long before the world found out the hard way. The name that made him famous nearly destroyed his career in an entire country. The descendants of the original Engelbert Humperdinck, the actual 19th century composer, took legal action against the singer for using it. They won. For years, he was forbidden from performing or releasing music under his own stage name in Germany, one of the largest music markets in Europe. The composer's son stated publicly that his father had never been a pop star and demanded the singer stay away from his family's name entirely. The pop singer argued that the name had been a pseudonym adopted by the composer himself and was therefore freely available. The court disagreed. An entire country, an entire audience, an entire market was effectively closed to him because of a name he hadn't even chosen for himself. And then there was Eurovision in 2012. At 76 years old, he agreed to represent the United Kingdom in Baku, Azerbaijan. He sang a ballad called Love Will Set You Free with everything he had. He finished 25th out of 26 contestants. Only Norway scored fewer points. Sweden won with 372 points. He received 12. He later called it one of the highlights of his career, which is either the most gracious thing a person has ever said or the saddest, and possibly both at the same time. There were financial wounds too, ones that cut deep and left marks that didn't fade quickly. Before he was famous, before anyone knew his name, he allegedly won £33,000 on the football pools, a sum worth closer to £800,000 in today's money. A life-changing fortune. But he and his wife could not afford the postage to mail in the winning ticket. The money evaporated because of a stamp. Later, in 2001, a touring company bearing his name collapsed into voluntary liquidation, leaving debts of over £260,000 owed to suppliers who had provided sound, lighting, and transport. A man who had filled arenas across the world left small business owners unpaid, and when he showed up at Eurovision a decade later and finished second to last, some of those creditors resurfaced in the press to remind the public of it. The romantic singer who had built an entire career on love and tenderness was being talked about in the language of court filings and unpaid invoices. He survived all of it. The name ban and the legal defeats and the public embarrassments and the financial collapses. He survived because he had always survived, because surviving was simply what he did, and because through every single one of those storms, there was one person standing in the same room with him who made the surviving feel worth it. Her name was Patricia Healy. She was an actress when they met. She became his wife on October 12, 1964, in a ceremony that preceded the fame, the name change, the sold-out arenas, and the television appearances. She chose him before any of that existed. She chose Arnold Dorsey, the struggling singer who couldn't get a record deal and had no particular reason to believe he ever would. And she stayed. Through all of it, for all of it, she stayed. For over 50 years, she was the architecture of his life, the thing that held everything else upright, the reason the stage felt like it was worth walking onto, and the reason coming home felt like arriving somewhere that actually mattered. And then, somewhere around 2007, something began to change. Something quiet and terrible and irreversible. Patricia was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's does not arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself with the drama that other illnesses do. It comes quietly, in small moments of confusion, in words that slip away mid-sentence, in familiar faces that suddenly require an extra beat of recognition before the name comes. And then the beats get longer, and the names take longer. And one day, the face of the person who has loved you for half a century looks at you from across a room and does not immediately know who you are. Imagine being Engelbert Humperdinck in that moment. A man who had spent his entire life using his voice to make people feel seen and known and understood, standing in front of the one person whose recognition meant more to him than every audience he had ever performed for, and watching the light of recognition flicker. He spoke publicly about it for the first time in 2017, 10 years after the diagnosis had likely come. He said it was hard. He said it was one of the obstacles in life that had been thrown at his family, and he had to cope with it in the best possible way he could. He said it with the same quiet dignity he had used to absorb every other blow the world had delivered to him. But those words, understated and composed as they were, carried inside them a weight that anyone who has loved and lost a person to that illness will recognize immediately. He could not leave her for more than 4 days at a time while touring. Full-time caregivers came to the house in Southern California every day. He spoke of them with deep gratitude, said they treated Patricia like family. But caregivers are not husbands. They cannot love her the way he did. And he knew that every single day, every single time he stepped onto a stage and sang the words of a love song that suddenly meant something entirely different than it had the night he first performed it. He admitted that the lyrics sometimes hit him differently during performances, that certain lines would find him in the middle of a song and break through whatever composure he had built for himself that evening. He said it sometimes tears you up and you can't help it. He hoped audiences would understand. He released an album in 2017 called The Man I Want to Be, a quiet, aching love letter to a woman who may not have fully understood what it was. He tended to a garden she had planted in Leicester, England, traveling across an ocean to care for flowers she could no longer fully appreciate, because somewhere in the fog of her illness, the memory of that garden might still find her and give her a moment of something soft and familiar and good. In January of 2021, the illness reached its final chapter. Engelbert, his son Jason, 2 caregivers, and Patricia, then 85 years old, all contracted a respiratory illness at the same time. She began refusing food. Medical help was difficult to reach. He turned to Instagram and asked his followers to pray for a miracle. He said their hearts were broken and they needed divine intervention. He was not performing for an audience in that moment. He was a man begging the universe to spare the woman he loved. The universe did not oblige. Patricia Healy died on February 6, 2021. She was 85 years old. Her son Scott was unable to be physically present and said his final goodbye to her over a video call, because the world at that moment did not allow for the ordinary grace of being in the same room when someone you love takes their last breath. His nephew, Father Paul, performed the last rites. Engelbert announced her passing on Instagram and wrote that she was now running through the glorious gardens of heaven, reunited with loved ones, no longer held back by her earthly limitations. It was the most beautiful thing he could have said. And it was the saddest. The man who had sold 140 million records, who had blocked the Beatles from #1, who had stood on stage with Elvis and Dean Martin and charmed the world for 6 extraordinary decades, was now a widower in a house full of memories. Some of them beautiful, some of them unbearable. He stays there anyway. He is 89 years old now. His final tour, the Celebration Tour, launched in April of 2026 from Sydney, Australia. He has said it will likely be the last time audiences can see him perform live. But even that word, likely, tells you everything you need to know about who he is. Because on May 2nd, 2026, his 90th birthday, he is releasing a new single called I Got You. The man is still in the studio, still reaching for something. His song A Man Without Love found a generation of teenagers on TikTok who had never heard his name before, and they streamed it by the millions. And he savored every single moment of it. He has said he wants to keep performing until God calls him, that this is not just his career, it is his life. And when asked whether he ever feels he has truly arrived, he says no. He has never been satisfied. He is still striving. After 60 years, after everything the world took from him and everything he refused to surrender, Engelbert Humperdinck is still standing at the edge of the stage, looking out at the audience, and believing with everything he has left that the next song might still be the one that changes everything. The man who lost a fortune because he couldn't afford a stamp, who was banned from his own name in an entire country, who watched the woman he loved forget who he was, and sang love songs through the grief of it, and tended her garden from across an ocean, and begged strangers on the internet to pray for her, and held himself together with quiet dignity when the world would have forgiven him completely for falling apart.